Cash payments, tax reductions, or new infrastructure projects. What measures are needed right now to secure people's incomes and jobs in face of a global pandemic? From China's policy mix to America's massive bailout plans, are government policies helping the businesses and individuals they're said to benefit? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined via satellite by Anthony Chan, former Chase chief economist at JP Morgan, and via Skype by Dr. Xu Chenggang, professor of economics at Cheung Kong Graduate School of Business. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. Anthony from New York, why don't I go to you? The Eurozone and America are both loosening quarantine restrictions as we speak and trying to reopen their economies. There's certainly a delicate balance between reopening the economy and preventing more people from getting sick. What steps should these countries take, and where is the balance?
Well, I think the balance is that the countries are, of course, very worried that if they keep the economies closed for too long, that the economic damage will exceed the risk of the medical risk. So I think that when they open, they have to really ramp up the amount of testing that takes place. And of course, they have to continue to encourage those individuals that are vulnerable to remain sheltered in place. And they also have to make sure that the people that go back to work and go about their daily lives go back very cautiously. And that, of course, entails wearing masks, that entails social distancing. And of course, it just really requires encouraging people that if they feel sick in any way or even think they're getting sick, to basically stay home. So yes, they're reopening the economies, but it's a very, very cautious process.
Now, the pandemic exposed many weaknesses, including those in the global supply chains. What industries or sectors do you think we should pay attention to right now, and how should their weaknesses be addressed?
Well, I think that the countries involved, and that's, of course, the United States and to some extent the others like Europe, will probably see that because of what happened with these global supply chains that, in fact, were to some extent put under threat because of this terrible virus, that perhaps maybe now countries will move to diversify those global supply chains. So I don't think it will mean that China won't continue to play an important role as they have, a very useful role, but maybe a little diversification of those global supply chains may be taking place, certainly over the not too distant future.
Well, Dr. Xu, do you want to pick up on that? A diversification probably of multinationals, U.S. firms in China. Where's the future of global supply chains?
Right. Yeah. For understanding this, I guess we need to understand how the globalization started. I mean, this huge wave of globalization. So the whole thing started in the 1990s when the Cold War was ended. So the ending of the Cold War is a condition for the globalization. And so then currently the situation is actually much more complicated than just the pandemic. So the pandemic is one more factor affecting this whole thing. So if we look at the globalization, that is essentially about trade and foreign investment, but it depends very much on geopolitics and diplomacy. So if China has keeping harmony relationships with the rest of the world, particularly the advanced Western nations, then globalization should continue even with the pandemic. After, I mean, but if there are serious troubles in diplomacy and in geopolitics, that is going to affect this
Certainly, the
continuation
pandemic is a big external shock out there. Professor Xu, you once wrote about U.S.-China economic decoupling, and you actually said that it is entirely possible for multinationals, for U.S. firms to move out of China, and China shouldn't really take it for granted that those foreign firms will forever stay. Why did you say that?
Right. So here the key issue is that investment is always a kind of a balance between efficiency and security. So that's why I mentioned how the globalization started. Right. So why the globalization started since the end of the Cold War. That's a security issue. So I'm an economist. So from the almost all economists would in favor of trade, which means globalization. But why in reality, globalization only started, the true globalization only started since the 1990s. Why? That is because of the security issue. So here, when I'm not saying that the decoupling is inevitable. I'm not saying that the decoupling is going to be very quick. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that the security issue can be the most important issue. Depends upon how diplomacy and geopolitics go. So when things really going in a very bad direction, then it could trigger.
Sure. I want to go to the specifics of fiscal policies, SMEs, and incomes and jobs. But before I do, one last question on the macro economics. Anthony, I want to go to you in New York. What is your assessment when it comes to the Chinese economy? A negative 6.8% growth in the first quarter. How things will look in the quarters to come?
I think in the quarters to come, the Chinese economy will certainly improve. It's probably not going to be like 2019, where the economy in China grew by 6.1%. In fact, I was in Shenzhen speaking at an IPO conference last year, and things were doing really well. But this year, I think that the Chinese economy will probably slow down on a year-over-year basis for 2020. I look for the Chinese economy to grow about 1%. We know that the difference between China and the United States is straightforward. The big hit in China occurred in the first calendar quarter. As you move and proceed throughout the year, you're going to see improvement in the economy. So far, I'm encouraged with the manufacturing sector in China showing great improvement. I'm not as encouraged with the service sector, which is improving much more slowly as the Chinese are acting a bit cautious, as understandable out there. And in the U.S., of course, we are going to see something a little different. The first calendar quarter will be weak, but the real deep hit to economic activity will be in the second calendar quarter. The Congressional Budget Office here in the United States is already forecasting 40% decline in the second calendar quarter for the U.S. I'm not so sure it'll be that deep, but something in the neighborhood of 35% or so is likely for the United States, and that's going to be a real serious hit. And then gradually the U.S. economy will begin to recover after the second quarter. For China, luckily, the recovery has already begun.
Right. In a recent opinion piece, Professor Xu, you said that lowering the reserve requirement ratio will not be much of a help to China's SMEs. Why did you say that? What should be done or should have been done instead?
Because that measure is only part of the monetary policy. In any country, there's no exception. In any country, monetary policy alone is not going to be most effective towards helping small and medium-sized enterprises. The reason is very simple. It's because for the SMEs, most of them are not in the securities market. and they found the difficulties in dealing with banks. And particularly in China, almost all the banks are state-owned. So the state-owned banks, actually, the lending criteria for the SMEs are very tough. So then just relaxing monetary policy is going to help larger firms instead of smaller firms. So if the policy is on purposely designed for helping smaller firms, and then it should not be focusing on the monetary policy. Here, don't misunderstand me that I'm not saying that monetary policy is unimportant. Monetary policy is extremely important for stabilizing the financial system. But here, what I'm saying is that monetary policy alone is not good enough for helping the smaller firms. So here, what I'm saying is that in particular in China, more than 80% of employments are in that sector, in the sector of SMEs. So if we keep in mind that we want to help this more than 80% of the employees, then monetary policy alone is not good enough. So
well talking about SMEs,
more
there
concrete,
are tons of them. Well, sorry, Professor Xi, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about, look at our counterparts in America, America's small and medium-sized enterprises. Anthony, in New York, America's SMEs are promised a huge injection of money from the federal government. How do you expect that policy to work?
Well, I certainly I agree with Professor Xi that monetary policy is necessary, but not a sufficient condition to show improvement. And so in the United States, we're seeing a joint effort by the central bank. The Federal Reserve is acting very aggressively by not only lowering interest rates almost to zero, but also injecting a lot of liquidity into the system. But because we know that monetary policy is not sufficient, we know that the federal government is also going to be running a fiscal deficit well in excess of $3 trillion to add money. They're also adding money for small and medium-sized businesses through the payroll protection plan that's going to allow small businesses to borrow money to pay for their employee wages. And of course, they're also giving money to the people that lose jobs. So they're basically really trying to support the economy on all fronts, the employees, the small business, and of course the central bank. And of course the central bank is also going to be supporting businesses that are a little larger, all of the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises. So they're really attacking the problem on all fronts. But keep in mind that even with monetary and fiscal policy in full force, until we resolve this health pandemic, the economy is still going to contract. In the U.S., we're still going to have, despite all these measures, we're going to see real GDP on a year-over-year basis declining anywhere from 7.5% to 8%. So it's great to have monetary policy working. It's great to have fiscal policy working, but we're still going to have a contraction of growth, and we're still going to see the peak unemployment rate approaching 25% or higher at levels that we have not seen since the Great Depression. So these are all great measures, but still, the economy is not going to go unscathed.
Well, talking about the pandemic, previously you told me that it feels like, in New York City, it feels like the situation there is 10 times as bad as those days in Wuhan. What is the sentiment of the businesses over there right now in face of the pandemic?
The sentiment of business, if you look at a lot of sentiment surveys, the National Federation of Independent Small Business, remember, small businesses employ over 50% of all the workers. You add the medium-sized enterprises, the numbers start increasing even more. But right now, the sentiment is not positive because a lot of these businesses are closed. A lot of these businesses, despite the government assistance, are still under the threat. They have serious liquidity threats. And my suspicion is that even after these businesses are allowed to open, that when you look at pure small businesses, anywhere from 20 to 30% of those small businesses will not be able to reopen. And that's the reason why the unemployment rate, even after the second calendar quarter, is still going to probably be hovering in double-digit territory. I expect the unemployment rate in the United States to still be in the 8 to 10% range, even during the fourth calendar quarter when the real GDP is improving, simply because many of these small and medium-sized businesses will not be able to reopen because of the deep economic hit that we're going to see in both the first and second calendar quarters of this year.
Right, talking about consumption, there are debates about the merits of giving cash or checks directly to the consumers. There are a lot of discussions about that online. Let's take a look at some of those, if we can get them right now. This internet user nicknamed SWAT, little o, said coupons cannot stimulate consumption. The fundamental reason is demand, the pure need for purchasing. As a result of those consumption incentives, the merchants will benefit the most by covertly increasing prices. Basically, this friend is saying that we shouldn't read too much into the consumption coupons and questioning the effectiveness of the food coupons. Professor Xu, what do you think?
Okay, for this kind of things here, really, as economists, the key issue is the purpose of designing the policy. So what is the purpose? If the purpose is our concern about the lower income households, then the easiest way is very simple, just give them cash, if that is the concern. But if the concern is something else, then giving them a coupon could serve for some other purposes. For example, if the government cares more about the government's budget, then giving coupons could save them money. And also, if the government cares more about their local economic growth rate, then giving coupons is possible that, because indeed, in reality, what happens in China is that these coupons are actually issued by the city government, by the municipal governments. So then in each city, they distribute coupons to the city citizens. So through that way, they could immediately stimulate the consumption within the city, and it's going to be helpful for the city, for the economy, and for the recovery of the city. But the difference between this approach and distributing cash to everyone is that you are going to have a very large number of the low-income laborers, citizens, without obtaining the subsidies. So
well,
I'm saying is this so-called peasant workers. So here in China, we are talking about tens of millions of peasant workers who are not subsidized through this kind of channel. That's my concern. This is a major concern.
Definitely,
and also there is another issue. The other important issue is the bankruptcy of the small firms. So if we care about the eventual recovery, then at this stage, one thing which is critically important is to help those smaller firms to survive. And helping them to survive, this voucher system is going to, the effectiveness of this voucher system is very limited.
All right, Anthony, what do you think? The U.S. has also rolled out a program that sends up to $1,200 or a check, rather, to eligible citizens. To what extent do you think that will be helpful in terms of spurring consumption and boosting the economy?
Well, in theory, we know that the marginal propensity to consume for low-income individuals is much higher than for higher-income individuals. So that means that low-income individuals are more likely to spend the money and stimulate the economy. So in that regard, it's a great idea. The only problem is that if the economy is closed and you have shelter in place, the consumers have the money, but businesses are closed. You can't buy it. So that money will help, but it will only help once the economy is opening up again, because even though they have the $1,200, they can't go to a department store to use it because the department stores are closed. You can't go to a movie theater because everyone is afraid of the pandemic. You can't go to entertainment. So they have some limited ability of that $1,200 to actually be spread through the economy quickly. But over time, it should have a positive force. And as I said, one of the things that I'm impressed with regard to the U.S. is that they've diversified the stimulus across monetary and fiscal policy, and even the fiscal policy between helping business and also helping the consumer and also helping the unemployed. In addition to the $1,200, the government has decided to enhance the unemployment benefits by allowing people to collect unemployment benefits plus an extra $600 every single week over a period of 4 months to make sure that those that are most severely impacted, namely the low-income individuals, that their income is properly protected.
Well, Anthony, you talked about a worsening job market in the U.S. We saw the official numbers that says tens of millions of Americans filed for unemployment benefits each week. It is certainly a staggering set of numbers. What do you think federal and state governments can do at this point in America to help save and in the near future, create new jobs?
Well, I think that right now, the best thing that government can do is to spend as much money as they can to try to develop a vaccine, try to develop a viable antiviral, even if they're not 100% effective. If you have a chess box or medicine cabinet of several antivirals that have some effectiveness, that will be very helpful, because until you're able to give some confidence to workers and consumers that it's safe to go out, even after the government starts to reopen, you're not going to get the economy going again. And right now, state and local governments are hurting because, as you probably are aware, the revenues have come down dramatically. Because if people are not going out, that means sales taxes are not being collected, and the government's revenue is being depleted at the local level. So a limited amount of things that the state and local governments can do, but the federal government, of course, is stepping up and spending as much money. But again, addressing the health pandemic is even more important over the longer term, because without that, all the stimulus is still going to have limited effects.
Well, Dr. Xu, there are reports of job cuts across many sectors in China, although we do not really have an official unemployment number yet. How bad is the situation of joblessness in China, and how are the authorities coping?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Actually, we don't really know, because the official data covers only the urban citizens. So the official data is hugely distortionist. So because in China, in all the cities, you have a huge amount of so-called peasant workers. And in the current situation, we are talking about tens of millions of peasant workers losing their jobs. So here, when we are concerning the recovery of the economy, a very important key issue is for the smaller firms keep running. But indeed, when there is a lockdown policy, when the logistics stopped, supply chains interrupted, for many of those smaller firms actually have nothing to do. So then if many of them go bankruptcy, that is going to affect the recovery in a very serious way. So to help the recovery, really the key policy should be there is to help the smaller firms avoiding bankruptcy. So this is the way to save the jobs. So at this moment, instead of creating jobs, the most important thing is to reserve the jobs. So as long as you still have those firms alive, then once the situation allows us to recover, then you can quickly recover. But if we have half of the firms went bankrupt, then it's going to be a completely different situation. So then preserving the firms means preserving the jobs in the for recovery.
All right, we have 30 seconds left. Professor Xu, there has been much talk about new infrastructure projects like 5G networks, industrial internet. How effective can that be? 30 seconds, please.
Right. That one actually is not going to be helpful at all when we are talking about preserving firms. So when the government has a budget limitation, so given the limited budget, it's better using the budget to help the existing smaller firms instead of spending in the so-called new infrastructure, because the so-called new infrastructure is essentially about high tech, and high tech is going to run much better following the market instead.
All right, Professor Xu, your point's taken. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I want to thank you as well as Anthony Chen in New York City. Thank you both so much, and I also want to thank our viewers from around the world. Thank you for tuning in to Dialogue. This is Dialogue Wang Guan, and have a good night.